Good afternoon, and welcome to the debate, Did Jesus Rise Again from the Dead? Thank you for coming today to listen to what these two men have to say on this fascinating yet controversial subject. My name is Brandon. I'm an engineering student here at SFCC, and I'll be the moderator for the event today. First of all, I would like to thank Falls Christian Fellowship, a club here on campus, for helping to arrange the event. Also, thank you to Daniel Kim for his persistence and passion that helped to make this event possible, and to the faculty and staff here at SFCC that allowed this event to be hosted in this beautiful facility. Finally, thank you to all the people behind the scenes who helped to make this event a success. Before I introduce the speakers and the format for the debate today, I want to briefly introduce the topic they will be debating. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth lived here on earth. Today, some say he was either a crazy carpenter who thought he was the Son of God, a moral teacher, a mere prophet, or in fact that he was God in human skin. Still others hold that we cannot know much about this man's life, let alone his death. The question, did Jesus rise again from the dead, is one of the most important and defining questions we can ask about him. If it is true, it has profound implications for all people. If it is false, it is one of the greatest lies of all history. As Paul, one of the apostles who claimed to see Jesus, acknowledged in 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is the faith of Christians. As in any formal debate, and especially because of the deep beliefs associated with this one, there are some ground rules for this event. Please be quiet during the debate so that everyone can hear what the speakers have to say. Booing, cheering, murmuring, or other noises that disrupt the debate today will not be tolerated. And you also have the option of clapping after each speech. In the question and answer period, please keep your questions concise and state who your question is for before you explain your question. Both debaters will be given 2 minutes to briefly answer your question, and they can only answer once. Thank you for your cooperation, and with that, I'll introduce our speakers for tonight. Dr. Eklof at the brown table. Dr. Todd Eklof has been the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane for the past 3.5 years. He is a native of San Francisco, California, and moved to Spokane from Louisville, Kentucky, where he lived for the previous 25 years. After leaving the Southern Baptist Ministry in 1987, he began a 16-year career in TV news and corporate video production, and re-entered the ministry as a Unitarian Universalist in 1999. He holds undergraduate degrees in philosophy and communications, a master's in religious studies, and a doctorate of ministry from Medville Lombard Theological School. He and his spouse, Peggy, have been married more than a quarter century. They have a 23-year-old son and an 18-year-old daughter, both of whom are college students. Today, he will argue that the resurrection of Jesus was not a physical event, but rather it began as a metaphor, and eventually was taken literally over the passage of time. Daniel Kim has been the assistant pastor at Lord Glory Korean Church for the past 5 years. He's a native of Seoul, South Korea, and has lived here in the United States since the age of 5. For the last 7 years, he has independently studied apologetics, otherwise known as the rational defense of Christianity. He is pursuing a degree in Dutch Biblical Studies from the Bible Institute, and will be graduating this month. After that, he will be moving on to seminary in California. Today, he will argue that the resurrection of Jesus was a physical event of history that best explains the historical facts known about Jesus. Please welcome our speakers with me. So here's the format for the debate today. Dr. Eklof will start off first with his opening presentation, and Mr. Kim will also have a 10-minute opening presentation after that. We flipped the coin beforehand, and we decided it that way. After the opening presentations, Dr. Eklof will then have a 5-minute rebuttal to Mr. Kim's presentation, and then Mr. Kim will also have a 5-minute rebuttal. After that, Dr. Eklof and Mr. Kim will each have 5 minutes for their cross-examinations, and then there will be 10 minutes of questions from the moderator that will be coming from me. And then after that, you, the audience, will have 20 minutes to ask the speakers questions. There's going to be someone with a microphone over on this side of the room, and when you have questions, please just line up over there by that rail. After the questions from the audience, both of them will have 1 minute to conclude their talk, or to conclude today. And with that, I welcome Dr. Eklof onto the podium for his opening speech.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here today. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate being invited. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to say much more about that, but thanks. Glad to be here. I want to get right into it with some verses from the scripture. And the main thing I want you to do as we go through these is look at the dates in which these letters or gospel accounts were written. So the earliest that I'm going to present to you is from Philippians, a letter from Paul written in 61, which says that Jesus became God upon his death, essentially. God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above all names. A few years later, when Mark, the first gospel, was written around 65, Jesus becomes God at his baptism. It's called an adoptionistic Christology. A few years later, as the story continues to evolve, Jesus becomes the Messiah upon his birth, being that he is reportedly related to King David and King Abraham, which the Messiah would have to have been. A few years later, we get to Luke, and now he becomes famously the Son of God at conception. And then finally, sometime in the early part of the 2nd century, when John was written, Jesus becomes God, sometime before the creation of the world. So what you notice from this is that over time, the farther we get away from historical Jesus, human Jesus, he is presented as someone who becomes more divine. So first he becomes, earliest account, he becomes divine at his death, and he becomes divine at his baptism, then his birth, and his conception, and then finally before creation as the story evolves over time. This refers to Christology, and this sort of evolution also takes place in a lot of doctrinal beliefs about Jesus, including the one we're here to talk about today, which is the resurrection. So Mark, being the earliest of the gospel accounts, you may know it has an original ending of 16:8. And that ending just really ends rather metaphorically with some of his female followers coming to the empty tomb, seeing it empty, and wondering what the heck happened, and going away saying nothing. Sometime in the 4th or 5th centuries, there was an addition to that very verse to help make it seem to coincide more with the other subsequent gospel accounts. So it has Peter and Jesus himself sending people out, so there's been a Jesus sighting. And then 9 through 20, I won't go into because they're pretty lengthy, but in essence, there are Jesus appearances, although he seems to have a different form that isn't readily recognizable. He appears to the 11 while eating and rebukes them for not believing. He gives them a mission statement, which includes snake handling and drinking poison. And then there is an ascension to heaven, while his disciples begin preaching everywhere. The other Gospels, Matthew includes appearances of Jesus, but there's no ascension. It is presented as a spiritual resurrection, and he says, and remember, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. That's how this Gospel ends. So kind of a spiritual presence. Wherever 2 or more gathered, there I will be also. By the time we get to Luke, Luke includes appearances, and of course, if Jesus is actually literally resurrected, where is he? Luke gives us an out by giving us an ascension story, which, by the way, is very similar to Augustus, the great one, the great Roman emperor who did great things in Rome. who was also rumored to be born of a virgin, walk on water, create healings, and when he died, like a lot of divine sons of God did in the Roman stories, would ascend to be with the gods in their realm. So Luke is writing to a Greek audience, and he makes him look very much like the August one, Augustus. And so while he was blessing them, he withdrew and was carried up to heaven. By the time we get to John, it's very different. Mary actually witnesses the body of Jesus. It's not an empty tomb at all. She sees the body, and some angels are standing over it. A second later, suddenly there Jesus is standing there talking to her. He spends several weeks, his physical body, with his disciples, just to prove that it's physical. Doubting Thomas touches the scar. So this is very much presented as a physical resurrection. So the evolution is a metaphor. Or isn't it beautiful? Kind of a beautiful way to end the story. Yeah, maybe Jesus died and he was laid in this tomb, but hey, it's empty. It's empty. And that's the way the story ends. Maybe there's something more to the story. Again, in Matthew, it's a spiritual resurrection. He changes form. He is with us in spirit through the end of the age. In Luke, it becomes a sort of divine resurrection in which he becomes a god, like Roman gods did. And in John, it is clearly a physical resurrection. So again, we see this evolution, this evolving evolution of the resurrection motif over time, where in 65, it's a metaphorical, in 85, it's a spiritual, in 90, it's divine, and finally, sometime in the 2nd century, it becomes physical, the more we go towards that higher Christology. Paul's encounter was a spiritual encounter, and Paul's letters precede the Gospels in the New Testament. So Paul, in Acts, as he neared Damascus and experienced Jesus as a bright light, a blinding light, and then heard a voice. It was not a physical encounter, but a spiritual encounter of sorts. And then Paul says in Galatians himself, I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. A revelation being some sort of spontaneous event in which he had this profound spiritual experience. Finally, I would say that you've heard of the suspension of disbelief that a lot of us go to these fantasy films with, because in order to enjoy the movie, we have to have a willingness, as it says here, to suspend our critical faculties and believe the unbelievable. There are other resurrection deities, and if I started to talk about them, they all are from different traditions. All were born around December 25th, the longest day of the year, and all rose from the dead around the advent of spring. None of you in this room are going to take any of these as literally true. They are almost instinctively, we recognize these are metaphors for the coming of winter and the coming of spring. But for some reason in our own culture, we're unable to suspend our disbelief quite often around the literal story of the physical resurrection. So those are my two arguments, essentially, that there's been an evolution from a metaphorical understanding of the resurrection to a literal or physical resurrection over time as the story of Jesus moved away from the historical figure into the Christ of faith, into the mythical Christ of faith, I would say. And then in some ways it startles me that we even can have this conversation, because I think Jesus fits into the same stories that we have had cross-culturally, cross-generationally throughout human history. I think I have a minute left. Good, okay. Well, I'll just yield to my friend Danny.
Just good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for just coming in, just coming to hear this debate. We're just going to say the rebuttals for the next section, but then I'd like to at least build up a strong case, at least for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the Christian faith it's a rational faith, and there are good reasons to believe that Jesus Christ did rise again from the dead. And as long as it is more reasonable than unreasonable, we can see that, that Jesus Christ did rise again from the dead. I'll be contending the hypothesis that Jesus Christ has rose again from the dead is the best explanation to the historical facts pertaining to the life of Jesus Christ. So I'll be employing the historical method, which Michael O'Connor, Gary Habermas, he employs for Christian apologists as well, and even historians like Brian McCullough and some of these other historians, they actually employ this historical method to see whether or not an event is historical. So what constitutes the best explanation here? The historians call this historical, they call this historical method basically the inference to the best explanation. And in order for an explanation to be the best explanation, it must pass through these four criteria here. Firstly, it's the explanatory scope, basically how well it explains all the given facts. Secondly, it's the explanatory power, and that's how if it better explains the evidence. Thirdly, it's plausibility, and if it's also in accordance with other disciplines, such as psychology, social science, and history or philosophy, and other things like that. And fourth, it's less ad hoc. And by ad hoc, what I mean by that is to have ad hoc is a fallacy where you're going beyond the evidence, and making up things on your own. So this is the creed that I'll be using here. This is my main source here. When I'm not going to say, even though I believe that the New Testament is inerrant, it's inspired. However, for the sake of this argument, we're going to assume that it is not, even though I believe it is. We'll treat it as if it's any other ancient manuscript. And so, if we don't use this, then the critics will, because the vast majority of the critics, atheists, agnostics, Christians alike, will assume the New Testament is at least good ancient manuscripts. And if we don't use it, then they're going to use it themselves. Here's my main source material. I'm not going to even use any of the Gospels. I'm not using Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And regardless of however it may be unreliable, maybe there will be evolutions. I'm going to use a main primitive source, which is the earliest source. And because this is the earliest source, it is more reliable. It lacks legendary development, because I'll be explaining later on why this creed is at least 3 to 5 years after the event of Jesus Christ. And this is a creed that vast majority of all scholars will agree to. Even Bart Ehrman himself, one of the greatest agnostics of the 21st century, will agree that this is reliable right here. And if we're not going to use it, Christian, if we don't use this, Bart Ehrman will use it. He has a whole chapter on this, saying he wishes that he could have been there with Peter and James with this interview. So I'm just going to read it briefly for us. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. And so it starts out saying, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, although some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." And so regardless of whatever may be going on, I'm just going to use these facts, and if I'm just going to use this as my main source. And if any other sources come in, it will be considered what we could call a straw man argument or a red herring. So the date of this creed is roughly 3 to 5 years, like I've explained. Paul writes this letter to the Corinth church around AD 55. And he sent it to them beforehand. So probably it's around AD 50, and most scholars would say that the way how he got this was from Peter and James in Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion. This is in Galatians chapter 1, verses 18. So in Galatians chapter 1, verses 18, which is actually an epistle that vast majority of scholars will accept, Christians, non-Christians alike, they use the term visit here in Galatians, and the word Greek here, it means historii, which is history. This is probably where Paul probably got the creed. And if that's the case, then the creed goes back to 3 years after the death of Jesus, which is incredibly early and it lacks legendary development. It means it's more accurate and reliable. So I'd like to present my 3 facts. And with these 3 facts, I'll be showing why the hypothesis that Jesus rose again from the dead is actually the best explanation. Even though we cannot say anything with 100% certainty when it comes to history, historians can only show what's more plausible. And that's what I'm going to be showing here. First fact is this. I'm just going to plow through this because it's a lot. Jesus, he died by crucifixion. He died by crucifixion. Firstly, the reason why we believe this to be so, or historians believe this, is because it's multiply attested by Christians and non-Christians alike. So the fact that Jesus died is not just believed by Christians, you guys. It's also believed by non-Christians, such as a Jewish historian, Josephus. Josephus, he is a non-Christian, and which means he's probably going to be unbiased. He has no motive to lie about this, and he says and testifies of Jesus being crucified at the cross. He doesn't talk about Jesus rising again, but he does come with the fact that he does say Jesus did die. And even the highly skeptical co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan, very, very way in the left wing of the New Testament as a New Testament historian, but he says that Jesus was crucified is as sure and as anything historical can ever be. Secondly, there's a low probability of surviving the crucifixion. And we must understand that the crucifixion, the tortures that followed it, were one of the worst ways to die. And to those that watch Passion of the Christ, you guys will know the incredible torture and the agony and the beatings and scourgings that he has to go through. And there's a very, very medical doctors will testify to this, that there's a very, very extremely low chance that he will actually have survived this, especially being 3 days in the tomb. Thirdly, David Strauss. He says that this doesn't logically make sense. So this is a logical issue now, not just medical, not just with the attestations, with multiple attestations with these sources, but actually logically it doesn't make sense, because he says that it won't make sense to preach the gospel unless Jesus did really die and rise again from the dead. He's an 1860 German theologian. He says this: imagine Jesus, right? He opens up the tomb by himself when he's in this half-dead state, after all the scourging and the beating and the nails in his hands, so forth. Let's say he beats up the guards, okay? Afterwards, he goes to Peter and he knocks on the door. And can you imagine Peter? What would Peter say? Would he say, wow, I can't wait to have a resurrected body just like that, right? No, he would have said something like this: you know what, someone get a doctor for Jesus here. He's dying. There's no way they would believe that he was the Lord, and the Lord, he's a risen Lord, and that's the resurrected body that they're looking forward to. And fourth, the reports are very early. Like I said, 1 Corinthians 15 shows that the creed is at least 30 years after the death of Jesus, because Paul has written this to the Corinth church around AD 50. But like I said, the vast majority of scholars would even say that this is at least 3 to 5 years after the death of Jesus, which is just incredible. It's incredibly early dating. And just a little side note here, many of us might think that some of the datings for the Gospels is a bit too late, or maybe 5 years is a bit too late, because we're used to the 21st century where news has to be like right away, right? But we have to understand, we all believe in Alexander the Great. Nobody denies that Alexander the Great didn't exist. However, the two authors that have actually written his biography is actually written 400 years after his death. 400 years! So we have something that we believe is reliable, but it's written 400 years after his death, and nobody doubts Alexander the Great was really great, and he did rule many part of the nations. However, when we come to the creed here, this is 5 years after his death, which is actually in ancient times. This is one of the best, most reliable early creeds and documents, ancient sources that you'll ever get. And if we say that this is not verifiable, then we have to probably dismiss most of all the other sources, ancient sources that are written by the historians. So the second fact, Jesus' tomb was empty. There's 3 reasons why we can be confident that Jesus' tomb was empty. Firstly, it's the Jerusalem factor. Jesus was publicly executed, and he was buried in Jerusalem, and his resurrection was proclaimed in the very same city that he was buried. Now, it would have been rather impossible, and I'll repeat, impossible for Christianity to get off ground in Jerusalem if Jesus' body was still in the tomb. The Jewish enemies would have just easily gone to the Christians and said, you guys think Jesus rose again from the dead? Let's go to the tomb and let's see right here. And if Jesus' tomb wasn't empty, Christianity wouldn't have flourished, because if it was the case that it wasn't empty. Secondly, Jesus' enemies acknowledged the empty tomb. Ancient authors such as Justin and Tertullian reported that members of the Jewish leadership were claiming that the disciples of Jesus had stolen the body. And basically they're basically saying that, the guards, later on it came the story that the guards have actually slept on duty and the disciples stole the body from the tomb. Now, okay. And I got some other facts, and I can't really go with the third fact here, but Jesus' disciples, they believe that he rose, appeared to them, And the best explanation to this is that that Jesus Christ it matches all the historical methods with the explanatory scope, power, less ad hoc, and plausibility. And until my opponent shows either I'm wrong about these facts or he has a better explanation towards these facts, until and unless he does, then I could assert with confidence that Jesus Christ is the best explanation, that he really did rise again from the dead. Thank you.
I would, I've got 5 minutes, right?
Okay.
Not much. Well, you know, I would say there's a lot of ancient literature out there, even older than the Christian stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, you know, one of the oldest stories that is not true just because it was written hundreds of years ago and people believed it. I don't think, nor do I think that anybody here is disputing that Jesus died. If you believe that Jesus was at all a historical figure, and I accept that, I think the evidence is overwhelming that that was the case, despite the myth that has been buried, layered over him over the centuries, then he died. He probably was crucified. Probably that martyrdom that made him a character worth deifying and mythifying over the centuries. So I don't think anybody is denying that somebody who lived 2,000 years ago would have died, and that the reports of his death by crucifixion, which was very common in the Roman community at the time, is probably based on some truth. However, talk about plausibility and less ad hoc. I would say that the idea of throwing a resurrection into the account is certainly ad hoc. There's been no evidence, no physical evidence, no other evidence of anybody ever having risen from the dead. I would dispute that it is evidence just because there is literature saying that such an event happened any more than I would accept that Gilgamesh rowed his boat across the lake of eternity and looking for a plant that restores his friend Enkidu to life. These are very obviously myths. There's no physical evidence anywhere of anybody ever rising from the dead. And the scope of this, to present this as literal, factual, scientific history, I think goes beyond the scope of the fact that it is religious literature written by religious people to either express their metaphorical beliefs or maybe their literal beliefs, but it doesn't make it established fact just because it was written by people, especially people 2,000 years ago, without the benefit of science and the sort of reason that has advanced since then to test these sort of hypotheses out. And yes, you're right. This early scripture in 1 Corinthians does continue to promote the Christian belief in a resurrection. The fact that it was written by Paul, however, we already know what Paul has said about his encounter with Jesus. It was a spiritual resurrection. It was an experience of a flash of light and a voice. It was not a physical encounter with a body whose scars he could touch or who he had lunch with. So I would dispute that that's proof that there was an actual resurrection and not some sort of spiritual experience of Paul's own that he took as an encounter with Jesus to give himself the sort of credibility that other apostles and disciples had. Yeah, I think that's good for now.
Alright, so Tom Eklof, he had some good arguments, and there's areas that I really do agree with him, and there's some areas where maybe I may not agree with him here. I know that he went all with this the evolution of the Gospels. Like I said, I don't have time to get into all of these things. I would like to, especially with this passages Philippians and Mark, Luke, John, and the differences and so forth. But I think just given that I'm using only the source of the Creed, 1 Corinthians 15, that I think that's the most permanent source that we do have. right now virtually all scholars would, historians, Christians and non-Christians alike would attest to that. So if you guys are still interested in that, there are a lot of books concerning the reliability of the Gospels. Okay, so I know we talked about the spiritual resurrection. Here's a problem with the spiritual resurrection, and this is the reason why I disagree with it. PhD historian Michael O'Connor, he analyzed the word natural and spiritual. And so the reason why he's saying that is because the passage in 1 Corinthians 15 and verses 44, it says how he went in, it says that he went in the body, he's sown as a natural body, and he's raised a spiritual body. And by the time when it says raised in the physical, it says the natural body, basically other people, Bart Ehrman and some like Richard Carrier, they're atheists and agnostics, and they say that, see, when it says he went in there as a natural body and raised up a spiritual body, this means natural is physical and the spiritual is just a spiritual, which is like a spirit. However, he's wrong on these counts because, like I said, PhD historian Michael O'Connor, he did a study of how this word was used between the 8th century BC all the way to the 3rd century AD. He has never found a single instance where the word natural is meant material and spiritual is actually meant as just a spirit. And also, 1 Corinthians, let's see, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14, the same Greek words for natural and spiritual is actually used there, where it says, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. And for they are folly to him, he's not able to understand them because they're spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things to himself, but is himself to be judged by no one. So we have an instance here where the very same epistle, where it uses a spiritual and natural, in the sense where the natural here, he's not using it as a physical, and the spiritual, he's not using it as a spirit. And also, if Paul wanted to use this as a material or immaterial thing, there's a better Greek word to use actually. He would have used that. And Paul's theology in Romans chapter 8, verses 30, he talks about glorified bodies, and it's very clear he's not talking about that. Now, concerning the pagan myths, there's a lot of reasons not why this is so implausible. Firstly, people say that Christianity copied the pagan myths. I mean, if we're going to set Christianity, we got to set all the pagan myths that are going around, like Osiris, Adonis, and all these other people. But we have to understand that these, like especially the creed here, this is not written as a genre of myth. It's written as a historical event. It's a creed. And so are the Gospels, but we don't have to get into that right now. Also, this doesn't hinder the historical facts for Jesus Christ. And thirdly, no Greek or Roman myth spoke of a literal resurrection, incarnation, and a non-theistic God in human form. So you're not going to find a single instance where actually they believe in a physical resurrection. This is totally different. And the biggest, I think, the weakness of this is the time factor. And there's no evidences, it may be true or not, but there's no evidences of a dying and rising God until at least AD 150, which is at least 100 years after Christianity began. T.N.D. Mettinger, he says that there's absolutely no dying and rising gods that preceded Christianity. They all post-dated the 1st century, which means if they're going to copy, they must have come before. If it came before, then maybe I could grant that it may be a little plausible. However, it came after, and because we have no evidence of a dying and rising God, until at least 150 AD, we cannot say that this is actually a myth. And also, he talked about, let's see here. He talks about the Paul's encounter, and he says how it was actually a visionary encounter. But actually, if you look at the Creed, chapter 15, and if you actually look at the Creed here, he actually talks about it as an eyewitness testimony. He says that he has seen the risen body of Jesus. And if it was just merely spiritual, this would not really be enough for him to really do this. As a Jewish person, he believed in the physical resurrection, and so and that's also that. I wish I had some more time, but also the deifying. There's no instances where Jesus actually he wasn't God before and he became God. You know, everybody knew that he was claiming to be God ever since he started the ministry. That's why they wanted to stone him ever since the start. And he made a lot of claims of his deity. And also literature, he's right that literature does a literature, just because there's a literature, it doesn't mean that it's true. I agree with him on that. And I think that just because there's a literature, you can't agree with it. But I'm just gonna end it with this. The reason why we believe this is because first, this is eyewitness testimony. The creed that we have is eyewitness testimony as multiple attestation. And also, if you look at the transformation of the lives, this best explains the transformation that the disciples actually had. And I think that's about it.
established faith until around 300. When Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian and mandated it become the state religion. So creeds were really based upon these stories. But to say that the intention of the authors was creedal, that this is the fact of religion and that this stuff stands out from all the other ancient myths that are so incredibly similar, it's hard to deny. I would be very curious about your evidence for this being written with the intention of being creedal by the many different authors who attributed material to what we call the New Testament.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good question because that's actually that's a very good question. People do ask that, and the reason why we say that this is a creed that's reliable is because in 1 Corinthians 15 it does start out by saying that what I received, or I'll deliver unto you, which basically means it's a Jewish way of saying that he's handing down tradition, and also he uses some languages that he doesn't use. So we know that Paul didn't invent this up. He uses non-Pauline language. He says Cephas, the third day, the 12th. This is not like his language that he uses. And also, this creed has a parallelism to it, which indicates he's passing on a tradition instead of his own invention or just a mere story. And these Jewish people, when they pass down creeds, they're very serious about it, and they would not pass down something that would be considered maybe more of a metaphor or maybe something spiritual. And so, I think at least we could say that this creed, maybe some people might not agree, or they may agree with this creed, but I think one thing for sure that we can tell from this creed is that at least the disciples were sincerely convinced that they have seen the risen Jesus.
Well, one of the other questions I would have is I think it's interesting as the Christian in the room that, or one of the Christians in the room, the Christian in the debate, I'll put it that way, that you only used one verse of Scripture to argue, whereas I used a lot of Scripture. And again, I would counter that the one Scripture you're using from Paul saying that he witnessed Jesus, in fact, validates the idea that this was not a physical resurrection, because Paul himself describes in specifically what his encounter was, which was a revelation that Acts records as a bright light and a voice.
Very quick question. You guys want to just have this be a 10-minute dialogue session? We had 5 minutes for each of you, but you can just have 10 minutes for dialogue.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll leave the next questions for you, though, since I think I probably asked.
Yeah. In that Acts passage, when he talks in that Acts passage, it does show that this was a real event. It wasn't just a vision, because also the 3 people were affected by this as well. So if it was just a hallucination that he had, it should have been a private event. And psychologists would say that hallucinations are extremely rare, and this was indeed a real appearance because of how even all the people have been affected by it. And also, I know some people had a lot of trouble with this because this is only one source. But then we have to admit, the reason why I chose this source is because this is a source that virtually all New Testament historians would agree to. Even Bart Ehrman, one of the biggest skeptics, would us of this creed. But we do have to admit, that this is the earliest source, the most primitive source concerning the appearances of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and how he appeared to the 12, and even the conversion of Paul, and even the skeptic James, Lord's brother. And also, and this is early. This is eyewitness testimony, and also with Paul too. He says that this is a revelation in me, and I know this is kind of some of the commentators, they had a hard time trying to interpret this, and I do agree that this is kind of up in the air a bit, and but then it's very clear that that Paul has seen him, and at least in the first century, to a Jewish first century person like Paul, they were under the understanding that there is no such thing as a spiritual resurrection. It is a resurrected, a physical body, and at least that's what even N.T. Wright has written a whole book on this. And he says that actually resurrections for a first century Jew, there's no such thing as a spiritual resurrection. It's a real resurrected body that, and had a lot of eschatological, I think, connotations with that. But at least in their minds, it was like that. And also, even with the pagan myths and religions and things like that, even if it was similar, I mean, there's actually nothing that's parallel with the dying and rising of Jesus. But even if it was similar, it doesn't show that I think the unreliability of this creed here, because for all I know, there might be similar events that are going on at the same time, but it doesn't mean that I don't think we could say that this document is not reliable because there's the same documents were kind of going around with similar stories. Like for example, like the Titanic. 10 to 15 years before the Titanic actually happened, there was a novel, and they had similarities just as the Titanic event. They said that the book said that the big ship is invincible, that it cannot be sunk, and it actually was going on the Atlantic Ocean, and also it says that it's sunk by, get this, an iceberg. And so and people would think that, oh, this was like a prophecy or something, right? But it was a story that went on. And 14 to 15 years later, the Titanic really did happen. I mean, so we have these two similar events, and are we going to say that these guys actually copied from the Titanic event? And actually, we can't. And like I said, there's no evidence that shows that these pagan myths about Osiris and Adonis and any of these guys actually came before Christianity. And so I think that at least there's no evidence, and if there is, then I would like to hear from you about that. So.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not an expert on ancient mythology, but I would be relatively confident that a lot of these myths preceded the Christian story of 2,000 years ago. Probably because these cultures are a lot older, but again, I can't really address those specifically. I don't have the research to deal with the dating. But again, I think it's quite a lot to hinge an entire belief in a literal physical resurrection on one verse without being willing to deal with the many other verses that are found in some cases that compete with or contradict varying accounts. There's Jesus appearing as Jesus not appearing at all in Mark originally. Jesus appearing as a bright light and disembodied voice. Jesus appearing unrecognizably in different forms to people, and then Jesus appearing as himself. These contradict one another. They're contained within a variety of scriptures, and I don't think it is enough for me to argue out from just one verse in which Paul acknowledges a belief that we would all accept that Paul believed, and that is in some sort of resurrection of the person he called Jesus Christ.
Well, I could respond to that. You know what? I guess I will talk about the Gospels then. Like Mark, I think the reason why that, because there's no appearances in the book of Mark, I think that makes it even more reliable. And the reason why I say that is because if they were actually trying to invent the story of Jesus, then they would have included the appearance. Actually, if this was a real fabricated story, like we see with the Gospel of Peter, which is one that it promotes Gnosticism and whatnot. But I think that because it doesn't have the appearances, it makes it even more reliable. Because if they're going to lie about this, I think that they will make a dramatic story saying, the disciples saw Jesus actually coming out of the tomb, and not only that, but there's all these witnesses actually saw him coming out, and when Jesus is coming out, he comes out in a wonderful state. But we don't actually have that. And actually, but then the book of Mark, it does imply that at least the author of Mark knows that Jesus is gonna he did rise again from the dead, because even though it ends with the testimony with the woman finding out that the disciples that they're gonna talk to the disciples, it ends very abruptly. But I think that we could say confidently that Mark knew that at least that they're at least expecting him. And also, there's a lot of sources that we can still use. I don't think there's any contradictions to it. And if there is, maybe I think you mentioned some specific ones, like how in one gospel it talks about one angel appearing, and the other gospel talks about maybe like two angels appearing, and some of them it seems like some differences. But we have to understand that in history, it's not like philosophy where if they have some different facts, it's not a contradiction. If anything else, we could say that these are complementary but not contradictory, because it doesn't just say there was only one angel in this gospel here, and it doesn't say there's only three. It just says one or says three, and I think it could be normative. There were sometimes some of the authors would explain that there's only one because in the narrative account they're only going to talk about or include the people that are involved in talking. And
I want to ask, because there is a contradiction. account says the tomb was empty. One account says she saw the body laying on the tomb being attended to by angels.
I don't think I disagree with the second part. They never says that she actually sees the body attending angels, unless that's some way another manuscript, but it doesn't say anything about that. All it shows is that it was actually empty. And
That's in John.
yeah, and also even with the creed in itself, we know that when even the creed says that he died and he rose again, and in that sense it implies an empty tomb as well. And if it wasn't empty, I find it very hard that even the Jewish people that are against Christianity would be actually saying that somebody stole the body of Jesus. Now, why would this apologetic that someone stole the body of Jesus be going around if it was still in the tomb? In that sense, and I still don't think that there's any contradictions inside the Gospels. And we have to see how we can harmonize each other. And I think the manuscripts are still there. And here's to get this: even if there is a contradiction, the Gospels, it doesn't mean that we have to throw the whole boat out, because if you look at any other ancient manuscripts, there's no manuscripts where you see that if there's some differences, you throw the whole thing out. If you look at ancient documents from Josephus, maybe from Philo or some of the other guys, if there's a little bit of differences there, we don't throw the whole thing out. We might say, okay, so this part doesn't agree, but the whole central idea, does that agree? And the whole central tenets of Christianity is still there, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he appeared to the disciples, and that the tomb was empty. And at least with those main tenets, we can still show that it is still reliable in that sense.
We're just planning to, I'll ask a question of one of you, and you'll have 2 minutes to respond, and the other debater will have 2 minutes for their comments on whatever was said. So I want to continue this conversation, and just, Daniel, could you explain a little bit more about Todd Eklof talked about the development of the Gospels over time. Could you address that a little bit more for me?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, it does seem like it is evolving, because starting from the book of Mark, it starts out it's the most primitive source, and so it's the most earliest, and this is written from Mark, who was the translator, John Mark, which is a translator for the Apostle Peter. He's the one that has written this, and it seems like there's some differences in there. For example, in the book of Mark, it doesn't talk about the appearances, even though it seems like they are expecting an appearance, but it doesn't talk about that. And even in the book of Luke, it talks about the ascension in there. In the book of John, it has some other details that may not be inside the other Gospels, but we have to understand, if these were all similar, then I think that's even more suspect to forgery, or maybe colluding together. Because let's say if we have all these Gospels talking about all the same things, then we could probably say, hey, these guys are colluding. History, that means that this is not really that reliable, because they're all exactly the same. And we can also see one of the reasons for differences is that some of these gospel writers were of different proximity with Jesus. For example, in the Gospel of John, the Apostle John, he was the inner three circle of Jesus. So of course, there's going to be some things that the Apostle John has seen that some of the other apostles didn't see. And for the apostle, when he's not an apostle, but for Luke, he's a historian, and of course he's going to write some different things about it, because as a historian, he actually went out, as a historian, and he asked a lot of people. He got eyewitness testimony, and he includes the ascension. And also in the book of Matthew, we can see that he was also a tax collector. He wasn't seeing everything that John has seen, or even Peter has seen, which is word in the book of Mark. And so I think that there's any major differences in these Gospels, and I don't think that they're evolving in that sense. I think they're just different perspectives from different people.
Yeah, I would argue that there are differences. There are major differences. Different accounts altogether in some cases. It's not accurate. It's not accurate history. It's not written as history. I don't think the intention of the authors was ever to write it necessarily as history. In fact, I think the reason we have 4 different Gospels is because they represent 4 different perspectives that different Christians had about who Jesus was for them. Perhaps serving as the original religious denominations of the Matthean Christians, the Markan Christians, the Lucans, the Johannines. But these represented different sort of views of who Jesus was and what happened. But I don't think there's a case to say that this is to be taken as literal history, or that we can dismiss the contradictions as being unimportant, and therefore we can take it all as literally true. That seems to me to be a weak argument.
Okay, so this is a question for Dr. Eklof. So from my understanding, many, if not all, the disciples, other than Judas, died or were imprisoned for their belief about Jesus. It just seems odd to me that all of them would be willing to die because they thought they may have seen a vision of a spiritually resurrected Jesus rather than a tangible, physically resurrected Jesus who conquered death. As you say, they probably believed in the spiritual Jesus earlier rather than the people who actually saw him said it was spiritual. Why would a mere vision or a spiritually resurrected Jesus motivate his followers to die such horrible deaths? And what would be the message that they originally preached, where they would be willing to pay for their lives?
Well, that's easy. Because Jesus had a lot of great teachings. Jesus stood for something. We become active on behalf of the things we value. Yesterday I participated in a march downtown, like millions of people are doing around the country, on behalf of Michael Brown, who is dead. He did not rise from the dead. And yet, millions of people are gathering because of what happened. Because their values have been incited by this tragedy. So I think Jesus, it's unfortunate that Paul, who said, I came to you and preached Christ alone, and even then Christ on the cross. Paul never talks about the life and teachings of Jesus. He talks about the Christ of faith that he came to know after he had this illuminatory experience with the bright light. But I believe that in Jesus' teachings, there is more than enough to motivate people to gather together and to work and try to live out the Christian teachings. And in fact, millions of Christians go to church for that very reason.
I think one of the reasons why this is such an impossible thing to believe that it was a spiritual resurrection is because there's absolutely no evidence that this was a spiritual resurrection. I mean, there's not a single passage in the Bible, not a single text in the Bible where it talks about how Jesus was resurrected spiritually. And like I said, the pagan myths believed in spiritual resurrections because they believed in the immortality of the body. We have to understand, to a Jewish, first century Jewish person, they believed in a physical bodily resurrection. And it also says, if you look at the book of Acts, it says this is a Jesus who we touched, this is a Jesus that we saw and we lived with, and this is a real Jesus that they have seen afterwards. And also it does talk about how Jesus has eaten with his disciples. It also talks about how he comes to Thomas and says, look at my body here, see this. And he actually touches it and says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus says, blessed are those that don't see me and are still able to believe in me. So like I said, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever from Scripture that this is actually seen as a spiritual resurrection. And also, I think that one of the weaknesses and the impossibilities of the spiritual resurrection is that it still doesn't explain the empty tomb. When it comes to the historical method, it has to explain the historical facts that are presented here. And Todd, he accepts these historical facts to be true. But then, how do you explain the empty tomb? I mean, if this was just a vision, Jesus should have been in the tomb. But the thing is this: the tomb is empty. And so, how do you explain that tomb? And some people would say, the disciples stole the body, but that doesn't make any sense because liars make poor martyrs. It makes no sense whatsoever because the disciples had no motives to actually lie about this resurrection. They had no motives. All what they ended up with is being tortured, being beaten, and they all ended up dying. And so I think that this is actually, there's no motive whatsoever. They're not in it for the money, they're not in it for the power. And I think the best explanation for this is they have really seen the resurrected Jesus as we speak scripturally speaking, and there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever about a spiritual resurrection or any of these kind of visions that he talks about.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question for Daniel Kim. Here's just a little bit of background. So let's say miracles are even possible. Bart Ehrman, a historian, has said that the resurrection is by definition the least plausible of explanations for the so-called facts of the resurrection that you presented because it is a miracle. He states that by definition, miracles are the least probable of all explanations for an event. Additionally, if miracles are possible, it presupposes a belief in a cause, namely God, that we have no direct access to. From our experience, everyone in this room knows that dead men do not physically rise again after they are dead. Yet you claim that Jesus rose from the dead. This seems like a contradiction. Is there a contradiction between our experience and your explanation here? Why or why not?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because I'm going to agree that like Barterman, what he's saying is that Barterman says that in our experience, he says miracles are the most least probable explanations because by definition they're very improbable. So the historian cannot use a miracle event as the explanation. But the only problem with that is that first of all, about the being raised from the dead, I agree that it is extremely implausible that Jesus would rise naturally from the dead. I mean, he talks about how he says because billions of people did not rise naturally from the dead, it seems very improbable that Jesus would do so, and I agree. But the claim that I'm making here is not that Jesus naturally rose from the dead, but that God raised him from the dead. And that makes a whole another difference with this. So if God comes into the picture, it's a whole different story. And also, Barterman says that this miracle is improbable, and he is in no grounds to say that this event or miracle event is improbable. And the reason why is because he's got to use a Bayes theorem to actually call this event, historical event, as improbable. And when he uses a Bayes theorem, there's a lot of problems because there's two things he has to explain. First, he has to explain the prior background knowledge inside the equation, and also he has to explain the explanation for the miracle evidence. So he has to have two things: prior background knowledge and the explanation of the evidences here. And the problem with Bart Ehrman is that he doesn't address the second issue. He only talks about a priori that miracles are improbable, and that becomes very subjective. And also William Lane Craig, he says that because in order for him to say it's improbable, he has to use a Bayes theorem, and because in order for you to use a Bayes theorem, prior background knowledge is very hard to find. It's virtually inscrutable because you have to find two things. You have to presuppose that God exists and also that God will want to raise Jesus from the dead. And because these two are inscrutable, he is in no position to call this event or a miracle event improbable.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I know of no evidence at any time in human history that a miracle has taken place. I'd like to see it. I do not accept ancient literature, and there are a variety of religions out there that have scripture they consider sacred and true, in addition to the Christian scriptures that report things just equally as amazing, equally as fantastic. But I would like to see the evidence that they actually happen. Where is Jesus? I've never seen a sea parted in half. I've never seen anybody walk on water. The idea that you can lay hands on somebody and take a person who perhaps has cerebral palsy and make them whole, that those things don't happen. And if somebody would like to present me with evidence to the contrary, and I'm not talking about touching somebody's skin and a couple of weeks later their wart disappears. I'm talking about miracles on par with those reported in the scriptures. So I think that's the biggest argument that I would make today, outside of what I tried to show is an evolutionary situation in which that physical Jesus that they felt the scars didn't emerge until the 2nd century, early in the 2nd century. That we know Jesus didn't rise from the dead. As surely as we know Santa Claus doesn't deliver packages on a sleigh. As surely as we know that Osiris, what mutilated body wasn't wrapped up like a mummy and he came back to life. We know this because it doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys please give the debaters a big round? All right, thank you for your answers. We'll have 20 minutes for the audience to ask questions of the debaters. And just as a reminder, please keep your questions concise and state who your question is for before you explain your question. Both debaters will be given 2 minutes briefly to answer your question, again, just like this. And yeah, we need someone to hold the microphone, please. And if you have questions, please just walk over here and we'll take it.
If Jesus was God, then did God sacrifice himself for us to appease his own anger? And if he wasn't God, then can we bring his own son back to life be really considered sacrifice?
Well, at least biblically speaking, it does talk about in the book of Romans how Jesus Christ, he was the propitiation for the sins of mankind, and in that sense, yes, he was God in the flesh, and only God could have been the sacrifice because at least just biblically speaking, only a perfect person will be able to die, and only God will be able to withstand the whole wrath of mankind, and so he was the sacrificial lamb in that sense that he did on the cross, and as Romans chapter 3 says, he was the propitiation, and he did satisfy the full wrath of God, and so that it diverts it all away from us, and it's another thing that Jesus Christ, he did fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament, especially from Isaiah chapter 53. It talks about how there's going to be a servant that will be pierced for iniquities, and that will die for sins, and through him many will be made righteous, and by his stripes will be healed. And yeah, that's basically the story of this. Just that we see.
You can comment if you thought.
No, I don't think I will. I'm not a believer in either, really. So.
Great. And also, if we can, just please keep your questions to the subject of today. Thank you.
First off, congratulations on the preparation, the energies you put into what you've done here today. So, respect that. The question I have is for Dr.
Todd.
Dr. Todd. Your premise, basically, where you built your case on the notion that the deity of Christ and ultimately the resurrection of Christ was kind of a morph, it was an evolution of thought, I think is the way you can put that.
Sure.
How do you reconcile text like Isaiah 6:96 to say, a child will be born, his name will be Mighty God, Everlasting God, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. And then the New Testament picks up on that the child is born. Emmanuel, God with us, the Hebrew on that. And then as well as Acts talks about that David said, my Lord, the Lord said to my Lord, and it's a quotation of Jesus from the Old Testament, being the Lord Yahweh, as well as one more, he did already too long ago. Also a quotation from, let's see here, pardon my nerves. So it is Psalm 45:7. The author of Hebrews writes that your throne, O God, is forever. A quotation of Jesus using the definite article in Greek as well as Elohim in the biblical Hebrew. So anyway, the notion of Jesus morphing into God doesn't. How do you reconcile that the direction process of God being born in the flesh from the Old Testament scriptures, which were BC?
Well, I mean, I would first of all point out that there are many millions of Jewish people who don't accept Jesus as God, or as the Christ, or as the Messiah, who fully believe in the teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures have been appropriated by Christianity and then interpreted to suit the Christian tradition. But there are many doctrines, like the doctrine of sin, for example, that does not exist in the Hebrew tradition, although it exists in the Christian tradition. Yeah, that's right. The doctrine of original sin.
Like Genesis is.
Of original sin, I'm sorry. That was an Augustinian invention.
Or I'm open in the Old Testament, you should surely actively and spiritually in Genesis 2.
Well, that's right. That's how it's interpreted by the Christians to point to a doctrine. If you search the Jewish tradition, they do not have a tradition of original sin. So that's verifiable. I could get the data for you on that. But more to the point, I would simply say that because I'm running out of time here. First of all, his name was Jesus, not Emmanuel. So if we're going to take it literally,
Yeshua, himself, Savior.
well, they didn't call him Emmanuel. They called him Jesus. But it's very easy to go back into a body of work that spans, thousands of years, and pick out pieces that we can interpret to mean whatever we want them to mean. So I think it's an easy task to proof text the Hebrew Scriptures to suit the Christian tradition. I don't think the Hebrew Scriptures were written pointing specifically to Jesus as many Christians do.
All right, and just for the future, there's only one question, and then Daniel will also be able to answer and comment on whatever. Sorry, no,
But that was fun.
I like engaging. I enjoyed it.
It was fun. Thank you.
very good engagement. It was cordial, but just for the future.
Yeah.
So,
Hello, my question is for Todd. Sorry about that.
Daniel, did you want to comment on that? You're fine. Okay.
You seem to doubt the historicity of the New Testament, which I understand given your position. But we have manuscripts that date back within a few decades of the original documents versus things like Homer's Iliad, which are within a few centuries. Why would we doubt the authenticity? Not historically speaking, but why would we not accept that the biblical account is accurate to what was originally written versus, versus things like the Iliad?
Well, I would certainly dispute, the historicity of the Iliad and some of those ancient texts too, but I don't think there's strong evidence to suggest that the letters and gospels were written for the historical accuracy. They were written out of religious bias and to reflect a religious idea. That doesn't mean people were liars or trying to deceive people or manipulate them. That's the way things were done in those days. It was quite normal to write entire letters and books in the tradition of a heroic figure in the name of a heroic figure. That's why we have, 6 of the 13 epistles to Paul are not believed by scholars to have even been written by Paul, but to have been written in his name, perhaps in the Spirit. There's Isaiah was edited over a period of hundreds of years by different authors who wrote in the spirit of Isaiah. So we have 1st and 2nd Isaiah in those teachings. So I just think to assume that this is history is improvable.
Well, for me, I don't think we have to really assume it's history. I don't think we should assume any kind of historicity of any documents without at least meeting some criteria that could say that this is reliable. And there's actually 5 reasons why I think the Gospels are reliable. And firstly, it has accurate copies. There's so much manuscripts. There's at least 5,800 manuscripts up to date. I think there's more now, up to 5,800 Greek New Testaments. And the reason why it's so important to have so much manuscripts is because we could actually test and see whether or not these are most closest to the original manuscript. And also, second reason is because of the eyewitness testimony. Other books are not done by eyewitness testimony. So many times it's written like a couple hundred years after the life, and there's a lot of legends that could develop from that. But this is actually based on eyewitness testimony. And thirdly, because this is also testified by non-Christian writers. There's people like Josephus, Pliny the Younger, and all these other people that testify to the facts that may have happened in the accounts of Jesus' life. And non-Christian writers will testify to these things. Also, there's corroborating archaeological evidences. A lot of the myths, they don't have specific people. They don't talk about Tiberius or Julius Caesar. They don't talk about King Agrippa. They don't talk about the Aegean Sea and different islands of Patmos and all these historically, like real archaeological places. I think also that's one of the weaknesses for the Book of Mormon, because the book that they have is not archaeological. It's not archaeological. So you can't corroborate it with what's really there. The cities and all these other things you could actually see for yourself that they're really reliable. And also, lastly, because of the embarrassing details. The Gospels includes a lot of the embarrassing details in there. For example, where Peter is rebuked as being Satan in that sense, where Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And I mean, if they're gonna lie about this, Peter being the pillar of the church, why would they talk about Peter being like Satan? And also it talks about difficult theology, things like Jesus says, the Father knows at the time, but the Son of Man does not know at the time. And there's a lot of embarrassing details. Some of these things that are there that are very difficult theologically speaking, and they would not include these details. Even the eyewitness testimony of the woman followers being the eyewitness testimony of the empty tomb. I mean, women were like the last people that would be reliable back in the first century Jews, but yet they recorded that the woman has seen it. So those are the reasons why I think it's very reliable.
So my question is for Daniel Kim. There are many people and many documents that have been written in the centuries after Jesus' death regarding his resurrection, whether it be spiritual or physical. And many people, yourself included, consider all of those documents to be true and accurate, despite having been written many centuries ago. If there were to be a mass amount of documents written about an event that, say, happened within the next year or two in a small town in the Middle East, about a man who was resurrected in this day and age, who died, came back to life, or say he could perform miracles. Would you believe those, or would you not? Because would you consider them as reliable in today's day and age as you consider the documents written many centuries ago reliable?
Well, I think that if they're based on eyewitness testimony, and if it's actually early, and if it goes through all the criteria that the New Testament historians would say would make it reliable, I think that it has a lot of weight towards it, and it's very, very possible. But there is actually many documents that are written about these things. Many of you guys may know about the Gnostic Gospels, Gospel Peter, Gospel Thomas, and all these other Gospels. And they have been, some of them have written a lot of things, and the reason why those are not accepted today in the New Testament canon is because, firstly, a lot of them are really, they're written really late, and the more later it is, the more kind of dubious the document becomes, and also because of the theological things that they imply in there as well. I mean, if all the Gospels are sound about the Jesus' divinity, about the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and so forth, and all of a sudden they say there's another gospel that goes against all the doctrines and beliefs, it's probably not going to be accepted. For example, I think it was the Gospel of Peter, where or one of the Gnostic Gospels, probably the Gospel of Thomas, where it talks about how it talks about Gnosticism and how women are, and of course I don't agree with them, but they say that that women are inferior, and they say that a person cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, and no woman can enter the kingdom of heaven unless they make themselves into men. And so, I mean, that's kind of just quite ridiculous. No one will really agree to that. It's not even in accordance with any of the other gospel writings. But I think that even if they did find it now, maybe if they did find it in the Middle East, and if it passes all the criteria, what makes it reliable, I think it makes it very much more plausible. I would consider that.
Well, so quickly, I would just want to point out that if you're not writing about the world, if you're not including the world that you're living in when you're writing about something, it's science fiction. Okay, the Grapes of Wrath was in the setting of the Dust Bowl period in the immigration west. It used a lot of historical references, a lot of places, a lot of realities that people experienced, but it was still a work of fiction. If somebody, 500 years from now after the apocalypse, the zombie apocalypse or whatever it is that happens, discovers the Lord of the Rings, they're not going to find anywhere in it where it says it's a work of fiction. It's actually intended to look like a work of history, even though it isn't. So, just because something was written 2,000 years ago and makes reference to living people, living actual places, actual communities, doesn't necessarily mean that it should be taken as history. It would have to be science fiction not to include those things.
Okay, but that's not. It says, if you guys are kind of curious about miracles, Craig Keener, he has a book called Miracles. It's 1,600 pages of an in-depth analysis of miracles, and he has, I think, has 500 pages worth of real genuine miracle documents of what happened. And so, if you guys are interested, you guys can see that. And it's from scholarly peer-reviewed journals. There's medical reports about it. A book called Miracles. He has countless accounts of miracles in the Philippines, and in China, in Korea, and even in India, real genuine miracle accounts. And so if you guys are, if you guys are curious and maybe wondering whether miracles are possible or not, that book might be able to change your mind a bit. So I can encourage that.
Any other questions? Come up to the mic.
And so you guys did a great job of arguing the point. The question for Todd, where exactly in John did you get that Mary saw the body of Jesus? Where is the scripture reference exactly?
Yeah, I have to look it up. It actually says she sees where the body laid, and there's two angels. And then seconds later, Jesus is standing beside her.
She saw where the body lay, or she saw the actual.
Well, she saw where the body lay. So,
Okay.
yeah, I misspoke if I said the body.
Okay.
But if she was there, like when it happened, two angels, and then Jesus is standing next to her.
I guess this is just a bit overarching question that's be directed towards both of you, but for those of us who wandered in, watched a great debate and are now leaving, how does this impact us? So, Daniel, if Jesus did rise again from the dead, how does that impact us? What do we do about it? How does it change our lives? And Dr. Todd, if he didn't rise from the dead, what does that mean?
Just on a personal note, I mean, if Jesus did really rise again from the dead, then we do have hope. And that doesn't mean that I'm not saying necessarily all the other, there's no other hope in other things, but at least hope as in eternal life. And I think there's hope for forgiveness of sins, and there's a hope that this life is not it, that this is just a temporary, this is our temporary home, and that we have an eternal home in heaven, and that those that put their trust in Christ Jesus, and they really believe in Jesus, and they really believe that He has risen from the dead, will have that hope, that firm assurance that through faith in Christ, they will receive eternal life, and that they don't, that they are a new creation in that sense. And so for me, it gives life meaning, and for me, he becomes into a real person, that could really experience the love of God through, and that there's peace and joy that He gives that I cannot explain just by thinking of natural things. So there's hope, there's definitely yeah.
Well, for me, the takeaway is if we continue as a species to be able to succumb to magical thinking, it prevents us from advancing into all that we really can be. So that's my concern and why I'm willing to debate this issue in public, because I think it harms us as a species when we can't let go of these myths, these literalizations, and deal with the reality. Religion at its best is something that helps us deal with the reality that we're in. At its worst, it drives us deeper into our delusions. So I'd like to see us get away from the kind of magical thinking that I believe that believing in a physical, actual resurrection represents. However, Jesus is a huge part of my life. Always will be, always has been, because I came from the Southern Baptist tradition. And his teachings are second to none. They can transform the world if we practice them, if we practice forgiveness, if we practice loving our enemies, if we practice nonviolence and turning the other cheek and sharing our resources with one another and healing the sick and caring for the poor and educating the children. If we did that, we would have a magnificent world. And we should be focusing on his life, not his death, or whether or not he rose from the dead.
You have one last question? Okay. That's
All right, I've got another question for you, Todd. Based off of the answer you just gave, what difference does it make whether we believe one way or the other if Jesus' teachings about heaven aren't true and aren't confirmed by resurrection? If we continue and evolve and become super advanced as a species, what difference does that make when we die?
It makes a difference now.
You guys want any concluding remarks? You can have a minute each if you guys want. But it looks like here's second to last question is pretty well. All right. Yeah, if you want. Do you want? Okay.
Would you like me to
Yeah,
conclude first?
this is sorry. That's
Okay. I would be happy to if that's what you wish. Okay. You know, several years ago, I did a crazy thing on Earth Day. I saved my junk mail for a year, and then on Earth Day, I carried it all back to the post office in a sort of private return to sender march. And you know, the news media covered the story a little bit, and I got back to the office, and a fellow had left me a nasty message about what I was doing, and he says, you know, what you're doing doesn't make a difference at all to children who are unborn or to saving your immortal soul. So for him, it was a waste of time. But my religion is about what's in between birth and death. My values are about what I can do in the lifetime that I know that I have, not a future of immortality I might wish that I might have. So I think that religion, again, ought to be about the here and now, dealing with reality, dealing with suffering, and appreciating the joy and the pleasure and the beauty that we can while we're here.
So for my concluding remarks, I know Todd Eklof talked about the evolution of the Gospels, and I've shown that there is actually no contradictions in there. And I said even if there is contradictions, we don't have to throw the whole water out, or the boat out of the water in that sense, or we don't have to get rid of the whole Bible just because of that. Even if there was, even though I do not think that there was in there, and even if there was evolution, he still didn't address the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, which was my main source that I used about the appearances of Jesus, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. I didn't hear a more plausible explanation for the resurrection of Jesus. He went on with visionary experiences with the Apostle Paul and so forth, but I told him that to him it was a real literal bodily experience, and also I showed him that I still didn't hear a better explanation for that, and like I said, I don't think that we could say that the resurrection is in line with sci-fi or magic, because this is based on eyewitness testimony, multiply attested, and the transformation of their lives. And I think that one of the most powerful reasons is, that the disciples, they sincerely believe that Jesus rose again from the dead, and I think that's also really good for me as well.
Please thank our debaters with me for their hard work.